I still remember the night he made that promise. The rain was coming down hard, drumming against the tin roof of our little farmhouse like it was trying to play an old hymn only we knew. My son was just 16 then, all lanky limbs and restless ambition, but he'd seen me struggling to fix the leak above the kitchen table and came over with a roll of tape and those big determined eyes. "Don't worry, Dad," he'd said, puffing his chest like he was already a man. "When you're old, I'll take care of you. You'll never have to lift a finger." I laughed then, more out of affection than belief, and told him he didn't owe me a thing. But somewhere inside, that promise took root. I didn't realize how much I'd cling to it until the day he broke it. Years rolled by like pages in a book you can't quite stop reading even when it hurts. After his mother passed, it was just the two of us. I watched Michael go from that bright-eyed boy to a man chasing deadlines instead of dreams. He got married, moved to the city, started a family, and I was proud. God knows I was proud. I told anyone who'd listen that my boy had made it. I'd sit on the porch at sunset, sipping tea from my chipped mug, thinking about that night in the rain and smiling to myself. He'll remember, I'd think. When the time comes, he'll keep his word. For years I didn't need him to. My back still worked, my hands still obeyed me, and the old house still felt alive with echoes of laughter. But time has a way of sneaking up. One morning I woke to find the world a little blurrier, the stairs a little steeper, and my own breath a little shorter. The doctor said words like degenerative and progressive, and suddenly everything I'd built started to crumble like dust between my fingers. Michael came to visit that weekend, the first in months. He walked through the door with his expensive coat and city cologne, smiling in that distracted way of a man who's already thinking about his next meeting. He hugged me, gentle, as if afraid I might break, and said, "Dad, you look good!" I laughed. "Good for my age, you mean?" We both chuckled, but behind his smile I saw it, the discomfort, the calculation. Over dinner I told him the doctor said I shouldn't live alone anymore. He nodded slowly, pushing food around his plate. "Yeah," he murmured. "That makes sense. Maybe it's time we figure out something." Something. That word stuck in my chest like a splinter. I wanted him to say, "Come stay with us, Dad." I wanted to hear the promise again. But he didn't. He just talked about options, about what was best for everyone. I forced a smile and said I trusted his judgment. But that night, after he left, I sat in the dark kitchen and let the loneliness press down like a weight I couldn't lift. A week later he called. His voice was warm but rehearsed. "Dad, I found a really nice place nearby. Great staff, beautiful gardens, lots of folks your age. I think you'll love it." My heart sank. "A place?" I asked, pretending not to understand. "You mean a home?" There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to feel every year between us. "It's not like that," he said quickly. "It's assisted living. You'll have your own room, your own space, and I'll visit all the time, I promise." I stared at the photo of his mother on the mantel. She would have known what to say. I didn't. All I managed was a quiet, "If that's what you think is best." When the van came 2 days later, I packed only what I could carry: some clothes, my toolbox, the framed picture of Michael as a boy. The driver helped me into the seat, and as we pulled away, I looked back at the house one last time. The curtains fluttered in the wind like they were waving goodbye. I told myself not to cry. Men my age weren't supposed to cry, but I did, because in that moment I realized promises aren't broken all at once. They crack slowly, until the day they shatter. The place Michael chose wasn't terrible. That was almost the cruelest part. It was clean. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and lilacs, and the staff smiled too much, like they'd been trained to hide the pity in their eyes. They called it Silver Pines Residence, though there wasn't a single pine tree in sight, just neatly trimmed hedges and a fountain that never quite worked. When I arrived, a young nurse named Clara wheeled me through the halls, chatting about schedules and meal times, but all I heard was the echo of my footsteps leaving behind everything familiar. My room was small but tidy, a bed, a dresser, a single window overlooking the parking lot. "Make yourself at home," Clara said cheerfully, and I almost laughed. At home. The words felt like a cruel joke. The first night was the hardest. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the place, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the distant clatter of carts, the muffled cough of someone 2 doors down. Every sound reminded me that I wasn't where I belonged. I missed the creak of my porch swing, the hum of crickets, the faint whistle of wind through the trees. Here, the air felt too still, too heavy, like it was waiting for something to end. In the morning, I tried to make conversation with the others in the dining hall. An old man with trembling hands who stared at his oatmeal, like it was an enemy, a woman knitting silently by the window, her eyes lost somewhere far away. Everyone had their own ghosts, their own stories, but none of us spoke them aloud. It was as if speaking might make the loneliness real. Michael came the first weekend. He brought flowers and a smile so bright it almost fooled me. "See, it's nice here, right?" he said, looking around the spotless room like he was trying to convince himself. I told him it was fine. He asked if I was settling in, if I liked the food, if I was getting along with the staff. Questions meant to ease his conscience more than mine. I watched his hands fidget with his car keys, the way his eyes darted toward the clock. He had places to be, he always did. When he hugged me goodbye, I held on a second longer, hoping he'd notice. He didn't. "I'll be back next week," he promised. I smiled and nodded, but weeks have a way of stretching when you're waiting. Days turned into months. His visits grew shorter, then less frequent. Sometimes he'd call instead, his voice rushed and distracted, promising he'd stop by soon. I stopped believing in soon. I spent my days in routine. Breakfast, pills, short walks in the garden, dinner, sleep. The staff were kind, but kindness isn't the same as care. Kindness is professional. Care is personal. I didn't want nurses. I wanted my son. I wanted to sit beside him again, talk about his life, maybe tell him stories of his mother. The kind of things I used to save for when we had time. But time, it turns out, isn't something you find. It's something you make. And he never did. One evening I sat by the window and saw a young man helping his father into a car. They laughed about something. A real laugh, full and unguarded. The old man held his son's arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, not of illness, but of memory. I thought of that rainy night again, of Michael's promise, and wondered when exactly it stopped meaning anything. I didn't blame him, not entirely. Life gets busy, people change. But there's a part of a father's heart that never stops hoping his child will see him not as a burden, but as the man who once carried him through every storm. That night, I pulled out the photo from my drawer, the one of us standing in front of the old truck he helped me fix when he was 12. We were both smiling, graze on our hands, pride in our eyes. I traced the outline of his face with my finger, whispering, "You were my greatest work, son." My voice cracked, and I let the tears come freely. No one came to see. No one had to. In that dim room, surrounded by silence, I realized something both painful and freeing. Sometimes, love isn't about promises kept. It's about the quiet endurance of still loving, even after they've forgotten. Winter had settled hard over Silver Pines. The windows glazed at dawn, and the hallways smelled of menthol and old wool. Most mornings I sat near the radiator in the common room, pretending to read the newspaper while really just listening. To coughs, to whispers, to the shuffle of nurses' shoes. That's how you measure time in a place like this, by sounds instead of hours. I'd stopped expecting Michael to visit before Christmas. It had been nearly 3 months since I'd last seen him. So when the receptionist called my name one gray afternoon, saying my son was in the lobby, my heart thudded like it still remembered how to hope. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, scarf hanging loose around his neck, but he smiled the same practiced smile. "Hey, Dad," he said softly, as if I might break. I wanted to scold him for staying away so long, but the words melted on my tongue. Instead, I asked if he'd eaten, if he was keeping warm, if the kids were healthy. That's what fathers do. We worry in place of anger. He brought a box of cookies his wife had baked, and as we sat together, the awkward silence filled every space between us. "I've been meaning to come sooner," he said finally. "Work's been insane." I nodded, pretending to understand. Work, traffic, deadlines, those modern gods that demand all sacrifice. When he glanced around the room, his expression softened for the first time. "This place isn't as bad as I thought," he admitted. I followed his gaze to the cracked paint, the blinking exit sign, the woman humming to herself in the corner. "It's not home," I said quietly. He looked at me, something flickering in his eyes, then looked away. We talked for an hour, small talk mostly. When he left, He hugged me and slipped a folded envelope into my hand. "Just in case you need anything," he murmured. I waited until he'd gone before opening it. A check. Generous, maybe, but colder than any winter draft. Money in place of presents. Still, I whispered thank you to no one. A week later, the flu swept through the home like a storm. Clara caught it first, then half the residents. I spent days under fever and dreams. My wife's laughter, Michael's childhood voice, the rain on the farmhouse roof. When I woke, weak but breathing, I asked the nurse if my son had called. She hesitated. "He's been busy," she said, eyes soft with the kind of pity I'd grown used to. The next morning, though, he arrived, unexpected, unshaven, worry-etched deep. He sat by my bed and took my hand. "You scared me, Dad." For the first time in years, he didn't sound like an executive or a husband or a man late for a meeting. He just sounded like my boy. I tried to joke. "Takes more than a little flu to get rid of me." But my voice cracked halfway. That night, he stayed. He helped the nurse change my blanket, spoon-fed me soup like I used to feed him when he was small and burning with fever. Somewhere between those quiet moments, something shifted. I saw guilt in his eyes, yes, but also tenderness, the kind that can't be bought or faked. We talked until the lights dimmed, about Mom, about the farm, about all the little things he thought he'd forgotten. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he confessed. "You seemed so lonely out there." I told him loneliness doesn't come from distance, it comes from absence. "You were my world, son," I said softly. "I just wanted to stay part of yours." He bowed his head, and for a long while neither of us spoke. When he left the next morning, he promised again, not the empty kind, but one born of remorse. "I'll make this right, Dad," he said. I watched him drive away, snow swirling around his car, and for the first time since I'd arrived at Silver Pines, I felt something warm flicker inside my chest. Maybe love, maybe forgiveness, maybe both. 2 days later, the administrator called me to the office. "Your son has made arrangements," she said with a smile. "He wants you to move closer to him, an apartment just a few blocks from his home. He said he'll handle everything." For a moment I couldn't breathe. All those months of quiet bitterness dissolved into a trembling kind of joy. I returned to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared out at the frost-covered parking lot that had been my only view for so long. Soon I'd see streets again, children playing, my son's face without a pane of glass between us. When Michael came to help me pack, he didn't rush. We folded each shirt together, wrapped my old photos in newspaper, and laughed when we found the rusty wrench from our truck days. "Wish you kept this for luck," he said. "No," I smiled, for memory. On moving day, every nurse waved goodbye. Clara hugged me tight and whispered, "You're one of the good ones, Mr. Henderson." As we drove away, I looked back once more at Silver Pines, not with anger, but with gratitude. It had been a place of pain, yes, but also the place where my son remembered who he was. When we reached the new apartment, the first thing I saw was a photograph on the wall. Michael, his wife, their children, and an empty chair beside them. "That's for you, Dad," he said quietly. "We saved your seat," and for the first time in years, the promise he'd made as a boy didn't feel broken anymore. It just felt late, but sometimes late is still enough. The first morning in the new place, sunlight spilled through wide windows and painted the floor with long bars of gold. It had been years since I'd woken to anything other than the dim glow of nursing home bulbs. For a moment I didn't move, I just listened. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of traffic, the laughter of children somewhere outside. Life. Real life. Michael had chosen well. The apartment was small but bright, with clean walls, a kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh paint, and a balcony that looked over a park filled with sycamores already losing their leaves. He'd stocked the fridge, set up a new armchair by the window, even framed a photograph of Mom beside the clock. When he came by later with the kids, their energy filled the rooms like music. They ran from one corner to another, giggling at the echo of their own voices. I sat in the armchair, smiling, pretending not to cry as I realized how long it had been since the sound of family had lived around me. Michael stayed after the children left with his wife. We talked the way fathers and sons talk when they're learning each other again. Carefully, like walking on a frozen lake, he told me about his work, about how hard it had been to balance everything, about the guilt that had eaten at him. I told him about Silver Pines, about the friends who had drifted in and out like ghosts, and the night the flu nearly took me. Somewhere between those stories, the distance we'd built began to shrink. He cooked that evening, badly, and we ate his half-burnt pasta on mismatched plates, laughing so hard we woke the neighbors. When he left, he said, "I'll be here every morning before work to check in." For once, I believed him. Days turned into a rhythm. Mornings with coffee on the balcony. Afternoons watching the park fill with joggers, mothers, and toddlers chasing pigeons. Sometimes Michael joined me for lunch. Sometimes the kids came after school to draw pictures that ended up on my refrigerator door. The loneliness I'd worn like a second skin started to loosen. One afternoon, while we were sitting together watching the sunset, he said quietly, "Dad, I'm sorry it took me so long." I reached over, placed my hand on his, and said, "You're here now. That's enough." It was the truth. Regret feeds on what's gone, but forgiveness grows on what's still left. The apartment became a place of small miracles. I started fixing things again, tightening a loose hinge, oiling the fan, building a birdhouse for the balcony. The neighbors began stopping by. Mrs. Alvarez from 3B who baked too many muffins, little Sam from next door who asked endless questions about tools. They called me Mr. H, and somehow that nickname made me feel useful again. I even joined a group of retirees who played chess under the oak trees in the park. They taught me new openings. I taught them patience. In those quiet matches, I found pieces of myself I thought I'd lost at Silver Pines. Still at night, when the city softened into silence, I sometimes caught myself staring at the photograph of Mom. I'd whisper, "He's trying, love." You'd be proud, and I meant it, because what Michael gave me wasn't just a roof or proximity. It was the chance to be a father again instead of a memory. We started having dinner together every Sunday, a ritual that became sacred. He'd bring new stories, sometimes troubles, and I'd listen the way I used to when he was small, nodding, offering little bits of advice that made him laugh. "You always think you're right." He'd tease. "No." I'd answer, "I just have a longer record of being wrong." One evening in early spring, he surprised me with an old truck. Our truck, the one we'd fixed decades ago. "Had it restored," he said proudly. "Figured we could take it out on weekends." I ran my hand along the polished hood, the scent of oil and nostalgia rising all at once. "You remembered," I whispered. "That weekend we drove down the same country road where we'd once taught him to steer. The wind roared through the open windows, and, for a fleeting moment, time folded. He was 16 again, and I was still strong enough to believe nothing could break us. When we parked by the river, he looked at me and said, "I wish Mom were here." I nodded toward the sky. "She is." We sat in silence, listening to the water and to the quiet forgiveness flowing between us. That night, as I drifted to sleep back in the apartment by the park, I realized something simple and profound: promises can be forgotten, but love, if given the smallest chance, remembers the way home. It had been nearly 6 months since I'd moved into the apartment by the park. My days had settled into a comforting rhythm: coffee at sunrise, a slow walk among the sycamores, chess on Thursdays, Sunday dinners with Michael and his family. The ache of abandonment that once lived inside me had softened into something gentler, something like peace. But peace, I've learned, never lasts forever, not in real life. One gray afternoon, while I was oiling the hinges of the balcony door, a sharp knock came at the door. It wasn't Michael. His knock was always light, polite, almost hesitant. This one was impatient, urgent, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. When I opened the door, a man stood there. Older, heavier, with streaks of gray in his beard, and a nervous smile that didn't reach his eyes. For a moment I didn't recognize him. Then he spoke. "Hey, old man," he said, voice rough with years I hadn't seen. "You gonna let your brother freeze out here?" My brother Thomas. The name alone pulled memories I'd buried decades ago. We hadn't spoken in nearly 20 years. Not since he'd borrowed money he never repaid. Not since harsh words had been thrown after our father's funeral. He looked tired, worn by something heavier than time. "Tom," I managed, stepping aside. "Come in." He shuffled in, his eyes darting around the tidy living room. "Nice place," he muttered. "Didn't think you'd end up somewhere like this." There was no malice in his voice, just surprise. I made tea. "Because that's what you do when you don't know what else to say." And we sat across from each other, the silence thick with years of unspoken things. He told me he'd fallen on hard times. His wife had passed, his business had failed, he'd been living in a shelter for months. Didn't know where else to go, he said quietly. I looked at him, the man who once stood beside me at my wedding, who taught Michael how to fish, who'd broken every bridge we'd built. I wanted to be angry, but all I saw was a reflection of my own loneliness, of mistakes that could have easily been mine. You can stay for a few days, I said finally. His eyes watered, not from pride, but from relief. Thanks, brother. At first it felt strange, having another heartbeat in the apartment. He snored like a bear, left dishes half, rinsed, and talked through the television shows I liked, but he also brought something unexpected, laughter. Real, careless laughter. We spent hours recalling childhood stories, teasing each other about old crushes and bad haircuts. Michael was surprised when he came by one morning to find his uncle at the table. Uncle Tom, he said, blinking in disbelief. Thomas grinned. Still the same brat, huh? For a moment the years folded, and my small apartment felt like the old farmhouse again, full of voices, warmth, and family. But not everything stays simple. A few weeks later, things started to shift. Money went missing from the drawer where I kept grocery cash. A bottle of whiskey appeared in the kitchen, something I hadn't touched since my wife's funeral. Then one evening, Michael stopped by unexpectedly and found Thomas half drunk, arguing with the building manager about noise. The look on Michael's face, disappointment, fear for me, cut deeper than any argument. After Thomas stumbled to bed, Michael pulled me aside. Dad, this isn't safe. You can't keep him here. I wanted to defend my brother, to say he was just struggling, that he needed me like I once needed Michael. But deep down, I knew my son was right. That night, I sat by the window and watched the park lights shimmer against the frost. Family is a strange thing. It's both wound and salve. I'd spent so long wanting connection, and now that I had it, I realized how fragile peace could be. When Thomas woke the next morning, I told him gently that he couldn't stay. He didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes hollow. Didn't think I'd mess things up again. He said quietly, Guess that's my talent. I gave him the last of my savings, enough for a bus ticket and a few nights somewhere warm. Before he left, he turned at the door. You were always the better brother, he said. I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that neither of us had been better, just broken in different ways. But the words stuck, and then he was gone. Michael came later that day, expecting anger, but I only smiled faintly. You were right, I said, but sometimes being right still hurts. He nodded, sat beside me, and for a long while we just watched the park together in silence. The wind moved through the trees, and I thought of all the things that come back into our lives. Some to heal, some to remind us what we've learned. Thomas had been both. That night I wrote a letter, not to send, but to keep. Dear Tom, it began. You reminded me that forgiveness doesn't always fix people, but it fixes the one who gives it. I folded it neatly and tucked it behind the photograph of Mom. It felt like the right place. Winter came early that year, draping the city in a hush of frost and pale light. My knees ached more than usual, the cold biting through every joint like a quiet reminder of age. I'd taken to walking shorter routes, from my apartment to the bench near the duck pond and back. Michael worried, as sons do, telling me to call him if I felt dizzy, to take my cane even on clear days. I'd laugh and wave him off, the same way I used to dismiss my own father's complaints about getting old. Funny how the wheel turns, and suddenly you're the one being fussed over. That morning was calm, the kind of stillness that feels like a secret. The park was empty, save for a few joggers and an old woman feeding pigeons. I was halfway down the path when it happened. One careless step on a patch of black ice. There was no warning, no moment to catch myself. Just a slip, a sharp crack, and then pain. Deep, blooming pain that took my breath away. I remember lying there, the sky spinning above me, the cold pressing into my back like stone. Someone shouted, feet hurried closer, voices blurred together. Then the world dimmed into the sterile whiteness of a hospital ceiling. When I woke, Michael was there, face pale with worry, his hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel his pulse. Dad, thank God, he whispered. My hip was fractured, the doctor said, a clean break, but one that would take months to heal. I tried to joke, Gus, I won't be running marathons any time soon. But the words came out weak, brittle. The truth was harsher than the pain. I couldn't live alone anymore, not until I recovered. Michael offered to move me in, Just for a while. I wanted to refuse. Pride still clung stubbornly. But looking at his tired eyes, I agreed. Just until I'm steady again, I said. He smiled, relieved. Of course, Dad. Just until then. At first, it wasn't so bad. Michael's house was warm, full of the noise of his children and the scent of cooking. His wife Clara was kind, bringing me soup and making sure my medicine was always on time. But slowly, the cracks began to show, not from cruelty, but from exhaustion. I could see how my presence bent their routine. The children had to stay quiet because Grandpa needs rest. Clara moved with that tight politeness that says, I'm trying, but this is hard. Michael did his best to juggle work, home, and me, but sometimes I'd catch him rubbing his temples when he thought I wasn't looking. One evening, after dinner, Clara's voice drifted from the kitchen. He's getting better, Michael. Maybe it's time to think about options. The pause after that word told me everything. Michael sighed. He's my father. He's not going anywhere until he's ready. I know, she said softly. But the kids barely use the living room now. They're scared of bumping into his walker. He needs more care than we can give. I wanted to disappear right then, to shrink small enough to slip through the cracks in the floor. Being a burden is a feeling that seeps into your bones faster than any cold. I started pretending to sleep earlier so they could have their evenings. I ate less, asked for less, spoke less. When Michael asked how I felt, I'd smile and say, stronger every day. But inside I could feel the distance growing, not from lack of love, but from the weight of inconvenience. One night, I overheard Michael talking on the phone to someone from a care facility. His tone was careful, hesitant, like a man trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. I didn't interrupt, I just sat in the dark and listened. The next morning, he acted as though nothing had happened. Weeks passed. The pain eased, the bruises faded, but the fracture inside me, the one no X-ray could show, deepened. One afternoon, while Clara helped me to the porch for some sun, she said softly, my aunt stayed in a lovely place when she broke her hip. They had gardens, music, even therapy dogs. I smiled and nodded, playing along. Sounds wonderful, I said, though every word burned. I knew then what was coming. The following Sunday, Michael sat beside me, hands clasped. Dad, he began, his voice trembling, you know how much we love having you here. But, Clara, and I think it might be best if you spent some time in a rehabilitation center. Just until you're back on your feet. It's a really good place, I promise. I looked at him. My boy, my pride, the one I'd once carried on my shoulders through rain and laughter. And all I could do was nod. If that's what you think is best. He exhaled, relief and guilt tangled together. It's only temporary, Dad. But we both knew that promises can be as fragile as ice. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of their home, the laughter of the children, the creak of the stairs, the hum of life moving on. I wanted to believe it was just for a little while. I wanted to believe my son still needed me. But in the quiet between those sounds, I felt something inside me shift, a breaking softer than bone, quieter than grief. The kind of breaking that comes when love begins to step back to make room for practicality. I closed my eyes and whispered to the darkness, so this is how it happens. The day they took me to the home, the sky was the color of old tin, dull, heavy, and mercilessly still. I sat in the passenger's seat, watching the city pass by in blurs of gray and muted color. Michael talked softly as he drove, trying to fill the silence with comfort. They've got great staff, Dad. Full-time nurses, therapy sessions, even a library. You'll make friends there, you'll see. I nodded, because what else could I do? He needed to believe it was kindness, not betrayal, and maybe in some small way it was. The road curved upward into a hill, and then the building came into view. White walls, trimmed hedges, a fountain that seemed to trickle with forced serenity. Here we are, he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite hide the guilt behind his eyes. Inside, everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and lilies, clean, sterile, and tired. A woman in a pink uniform greeted us at the desk with a practiced smile. Welcome to Maple Ridge, she chirped. Her eyes slid to me briefly, then back to Michael, because people always talk to the younger one when the older one looks too fragile. We've prepared everything. He'll be very comfortable here. I remember the way she said he instead of you, as if I were a package being handed over. They showed us my room, small but tidy, with beige curtains and a single window overlooking the garden. My name was already printed neatly on a card at the door, Mr. Arthur Bennett. Seeing my name there felt strange, like reading my own gravestone. Michael helped me unpack. Photographs, a few books, my shaving kit. "You can call me any time," he said, voice thick. "I'll visit every weekend." I placed a hand on his shoulder and forced a smile. "I know you will, son." He hugged me tight, longer than usual, and I felt the tremor in his breath. When he finally left, I stood by the window and watched his car shrink into the distance until it was just another speck swallowed by the horizon. The fountain outside kept trickling, indifferent to everything. The first night was the hardest. The bed was too firm, the silence too heavy. I could hear muffled sobs from the room next door, a man coughing down the hall, the hum of fluorescent lights that never quite went dark. In the morning, a nurse named Ruth brought breakfast on a tray, eggs, toast, and a plastic cup of pills. "Eat up, Mr. Bennett," she said brightly. "You've got physiotherapy at 10. She was kind, but her kindness was routine, the kind that comes from doing the same thing for hundreds of strangers. Days blurred into each other. There was bingo on Wednesdays, piano hour on Fridays, and a priest who came every Sunday to talk about hope. I listened, nodded, and smiled in all the right places. But inside, I was shrinking, not from age, but from absence. The absence of my home, my freedom, my son's laughter. I used to count the days between Michael's visits, but soon I started counting the excuses. "Sorry, Dad, work's been crazy. Clara's not feeling well. The kids have exams." Each missed visit stung a little less, which somehow made it hurt more. One afternoon, I sat by the window with my book open but unread. Outside, a young man was pushing his grandfather in a wheelchair along the garden path. The old man was smiling, his hand resting lightly on the boy's arm. Something about that simple touch broke me open. I pressed my palm against the glass, as if I could reach through it, as if I could still be part of that world. The nurse found me crying quietly and asked if I was in pain. I just nodded. She gave me another pill, but there are some aches medicine can't touch. Weeks turned into months. I became a familiar face in the hallways, known for my quiet manners and the way I always wore a pressed shirt. The staff liked me because I never complained. But at night, when the halls emptied and the lights dimmed, I'd whisper to the walls, "He promised." Over and over, like a prayer that no one could hear. Then one day, Michael showed up unannounced. He looked tired, older somehow. "Hey, Dad," he said, forcing cheer. "Thought I'd surprise you." I wanted to be angry, to ask why he'd stayed away for so long. But when I saw the way his hands trembled, I knew life had been wearing him down too. We walked through the garden, the same one I'd stared at from my window for months. "The kids miss you," he said. "Clara does too." I smiled faintly. "Do they still talk about me?" He hesitated. "Of course, Dad," but I could tell he was lying to protect me. Before he left, he slipped an envelope into my hand. "Something I've been meaning to give you," he said. After he drove away, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. Me holding him as a baby, both of us laughing. On the back, in his handwriting, were 5 words I never meant to fail. I sat there for a long time, staring at that photo until the ink blurred with my tears. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. Because even if the world had grown smaller, even if the promise had broken, there was still love buried beneath the ruin. Tired, imperfect love that somehow still reached me. It was early spring when the letter idea came to me. The gardens outside Maple Ridge had started to wake from winter's sleep. Tulips pushing through the soil, robins nesting in the hedges. I sat by the same window every morning, watching life happen from behind the glass, feeling both grateful and invisible. That day, while Ruth changed the linens, she asked if I wanted to write any letters. "We can mail them for you, Mr. Bennett. Keeps the mind sharp," she said with that patient smile. I almost declined. Who would I even write to? But then, like a whisper, the thought came to him. To the boy who became the man who put me here. To my son. That night, I took out the old stationery Michael had brought me months ago, still crisp and unused. The pen trembled in my hand as I began. "My dear son," I wrote, "I've been thinking about promises, the ones we keep, and the ones that keep us." The words poured out slowly at first, then faster, like a flood that had been building behind my ribs for years. I wrote about the day he was born, how terrified and proud I'd been holding something so small yet so full of meaning. I reminded him of the nights we built model trains, of the summers we spent fishing, of the first time he beat me at chess, and how I pretended to be annoyed just to make him laugh. Then I wrote about the day his mother died, how I'd felt the weight of the world shift onto me and later onto him. And finally I wrote about the promise. You told me you'd take care of me in my old age, son. I believed you, not because I needed care, but because I needed to believe love could last longer than strength. Maybe I was wrong to expect that of you. Maybe it's unfair for fathers to want their sons to love them the same way they once loved their sons, fiercely, without conditions. But I don't blame you. You did what you thought was best. You gave me safety when you couldn't give me time. By the time I finished, tears had blurred the ink. I folded the pages carefully, sealed the envelope, and handed it to Ruth the next morning. Could you mail this for me? I asked. She looked at the shaky handwriting on the front, to Michael Bennett, and smiled softly. Of course, Mr. Bennett. I didn't expect a reply. I only wanted my truth to find him, wherever he was. Weeks passed. Life in the home went on as usual, bingo pills, polite smiles. But something inside me had shifted. I stopped watching the clock, stopped counting the empty weekends. Writing the letter had felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. I'd let go of bitterness, replaced it with something quieter, acceptance. I told myself that was enough. Then, one rainy afternoon, Ruth came running into my room, breathless. Mr. Bennett, she said, your son's here. My heart stuttered. I looked toward the doorway, and there he was, soaked, disheveled, eyes red like he hadn't slept in days. Dad? He said softly, voice cracking. I couldn't speak. He crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees beside my chair, gripping my hands like a drowning man. I'm sorry, he whispered. God, I'm so sorry. He told me he'd read the letter 100 times. That every word had hit him like a hammer, breaking through the wall of excuses he'd built. You were right, he said. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. From guilt, from responsibility, from remembering how much you meant to me. I told myself you were safe, that was enough. But it wasn't. He looked older, smaller somehow, the same way I once looked the day I told my own father goodbye. I didn't want him to cry. I'd already forgiven him the moment I sealed that envelope. I placed my hand on his cheek. Son, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, you didn't fail me. You just forgot who you were for a while. We all do. He stayed the whole day. We talked like we used to, about old neighbors, about Mom, about the world outside. He wheeled me through the garden, pointing out the tulips and the newborn birds. Before he left, he said, I'm bringing you home, Dad. Not today, but soon. I promise. I smiled gently, because I'd learned what promises really were, hopes dressed in words. Take your time, I said. Just don't forget this time. After he left, Ruth came in with my evening tea. That was a lovely visit, she said. I nodded, looking out the window at the lingering rain. Yes, I murmured.
It was?
But in my heart I felt something healing, something deep and fragile, like frost melting in sunlight. That night, I took out another sheet of paper and began a new letter, just 3 lines long. My dear son, you came back. That's all I ever needed. Love, Dad. The days after Michael's visit felt different, lighter, as if the air itself had softened around me. Even the walls of Maple Ridge seemed less suffocating. The same beige corridors now carrying whispers of something new hope. Every morning, I woke with the faint ache of anticipation, like a child waiting for Christmas. Michael had promised to bring me home, soon, and though I knew better than to anchor my heart to promises, I couldn't help but believe him this time. There was a steadiness in his eyes when he said it. Not guilt, not pity, but resolve. Still, I told no one. I kept it tucked inside me, quiet and precious. Weeks passed, and each day he came. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes just long enough to sit with me in silence. He brought coffee, photographs, even my old record player, the one that used to fill our house with music when his mother was alive. We'd listen to Sinatra or Nat King Cole, and for a while, it felt like time had folded back, letting me relive the softness of things once lost. The nurses began to smile when they saw him. Ruth even joked, if your son keeps showing up like this, we'll have to start charging him rent. I laughed, but inside, I knew what she didn't. He wasn't visiting out of duty anymore. He was visiting out of love. Then one morning he arrived with that same nervous smile he had when he was 10 years old and hiding a broken vase behind his back. "Dad," he said, sitting across from me, "I've been talking with Clara. The house that's ready. We've fixed up the guest room. Well, your room now. There's a ramp out front and grab bars in the bathroom. We even got that recliner you liked." His voice trembled on that last sentence. "If you want to come home, we can leave tomorrow." For a long moment I couldn't speak. My heart thudded so loudly it drowned out everything else. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy who used to run barefoot through sprinklers, the teenager who stayed up late studying by the kitchen light, the man who once forgot how to be a son but had found his way back. My voice cracked when I said, "I'd like that very much." Leaving Maple Ridge was strangely bittersweet. The staff gathered to wish me well. Ruth hugged me tight, whispering, "You're one of the good ones, Mr. Bennett." I smiled, though my eyes burned. The car ride home felt like crossing worlds, from stillness into motion, from surrender into life. When we pulled into Michael's driveway, the children were waiting with handmade signs that said, "Welcome home, Grandpa." Clara stood on the porch, her smile warm and genuine this time, not the polite one she used to wear. "We're so happy you're back," she said, and I believed her. The first few days were a blur of laughter, small adjustments, and quiet gratitude. My room was perfect, sunlit, comfortable, with my books neatly stacked and my wife's photo on the nightstand. Michael helped me settle into the recliner, and I remember saying, "Feels like heaven." He chuckled. "Let's keep you here a while longer before you go there, okay?" We laughed until tears came, not from sadness, but from the relief of having survived the distance between us. Every evening became a ritual. Michael would bring tea, and we'd sit by the window watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't need to. One night he said quietly, "You were right in your letter. Promises are easy when life's easy. The real ones are the ones you keep when it's hard." I looked at him, pride swelling in my chest. "You kept yours, son," I said softly. "Maybe not the way I imagined, but you did." As the weeks turned into months, I grew weaker, not from sadness, but from time itself doing what time always does. Yet I was content. The house that once echoed with my absence now felt alive again. On my last good morning, the sun streamed through the curtains, warm and gentle. Michael came in, carrying 2 cups of coffee, mine just the way I liked it, black with a hint of sugar. "Morning, Dad," he said, his voice bright. I smiled. "Morning, son. Sit with me." We sat there for a long while, listening to the world waking outside, birds calling, the faint laughter of his children, the hum of a life well lived. I turned to him and said, "Do you remember what I told you when you were little? That a man's worth isn't measured by what he builds, but by what he mends." He nodded, eyes glistening. "You mended us, son," I whispered. "That's what matters." Later that day, when the house grew quiet, I closed my eyes. I thought of my wife's laughter, of little Michael running through the yard, of promises broken and found again. And in that final, drifting moment between waking and sleep, I smiled, because my son had kept his word after all. He had brought me home.